Welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne, a place where we have conscious conversations about things that really matter in our lives. And now, here's your host, Roxanne Derhaj.
Hi everyone, it's Roxanne Derhaj. Thanks again for tuning in for Authentic Living with Roxanne. Today I have a special guest, Kendra Weenie. Kendra and I initially met her brother, who I recently interviewed on the podcast, and Kendra has a quite an intriguing path herself, and I asked her to come on and share her story with us. So Kendra, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about, this is an interesting topic and something that's dear to my heart. Unfortunately, having witnessed it as a child, it's something that I can relate to. And Kendra has written a book called Surviving Domestic Violence. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, and that's what she's going to be talking about today. Predominantly is kind of things that are related to domestic violence and self-care. Her book is a memoir that outlines the challenges of breaking out of the intergenerational cycle of violence. She shares her experience of growing up in poverty on Sweetgrass First Nation, being raised by a single mom, and circumstances leading up to her former abusive relationships. She shares messages of hope and self-care while taking you on her healing journey. I would like to just kind of talk a little bit about that path that life kind of took you on. And like I said, having talked to your brother a little bit and spent some time with him, I know a little bit of the story, but I want to kind of honor your space and for you to tell me about your path and kind of what things were like for you growing up.
Yeah, definitely. So me and Kendall have had the opportunity to speak at a few events together where we were asked to go and share our stories. And I usually tell people we grew up together, but our experiences were very different. What I mean when I say that is my relationship with my parents was a lot different than his relationship with our parents. I'm the eldest daughter in our family of four. Kendall's the oldest child in our family. So he was more, how would you say it, favored, I guess, being the eldest and only boy in our family. And because I'm the eldest daughter, a lot more responsibility was put on me. I didn't have the closest relationship with my mom, who was a single parent, unfortunately. And our dad was an absent father, to us growing up. And I always thought I was closest to my dad out of all my siblings, and I really needed him around growing up. So that really affected me as a child and as a young adult. So I grew up having a lot of anger issues, a lot of resentment towards both my parents. And that, of course, led to a lot of self-esteem issues. I was never exposed to a healthy relationship, so I didn't know what to look for when I started dating at the age of 14. And but the one thing I want to mention, I also spent a chapter talking about sports in my book. When I became involved in sports at the age of 14, it was like my anger management. It was like a really great form of therapy for me. It was a really good way for me to let out all that anger and frustration that I held towards mostly my parents. And but around that age, I remember feeling really just a huge lack of love overall. I was struggling a lot with my mental health. I don't actually open up about it a lot in the book, but I've always struggled with anxiety and depression growing up. I just don't talk about it in much detail in my book, or even now. Like usually I'll talk about it during when I go to see my counselor, but not so much with like the work that I'm doing. So I was having a lot of, mental health issues and even suicidal thoughts. Like my thoughts got that dark at that age. And I thought, well, if, no one's going to love me at home, I'm going to go find a boy to love me. So I thought finding somebody to love me was the answer to all my problems. That's where my mind was at that vulnerable age. So I started dating with no standards. It was pretty much, if a boy liked me, then we're going out. And for 10 years, I was just kind of caught up in this destructive dating phase where towards the end of that 10 years, I was attracting the same types of partners. I found myself attracting guys who were controlling, guys who usually had some kind of addiction. Usually it was alcoholism, and just really, I was caught up in a cycle of toxic relationships because I was drinking at that age too. I drank quite a bit, and usually that's how I would end up meeting my partners, in my early 20s. And then by the time I was 24, I graduated from it's called the ITEP program at the University of Saskatchewan. So it's a Bachelor of Education. And I remember this was the last time I actually, kind of went out drinking. I decided to quit after I became a mom. But so that last night on my graduation night, I decided, I'm going to go out and celebrate with two of my, best friends, and go and meet a new man, because I was single at the time, and I was about to repeat another very toxic cycle. And so I go out to the bar, and as I'm sure you know, and the listeners know, it's not very hard to meet somebody at the bar. It's not very hard, but those are usually the worst kinds of people, So I'm dancing on the dance floor, and it must have been like after midnight sometime. And even like my memory of that night is quite vague because I had a little bit too much to drink. And I remember seeing this really tall, handsome Black man just outside of my circle of friends that I was dancing with. And what I remember from that night was I'd never even been attracted to Black men up until this point, but there was just something about him. There was something about him. Well, for one, he was very handsome, like a very handsome man, very tall. And I recognized him from a volleyball tournament like years prior. So there was a connection there, and I had a reason to go and talk to him. So I'm actually the one who pursued him. And Chris and I started dating like almost immediately after we met. And I go into a lot more detail in my book about that night, like from, the little that I remember and what Chris told me. And man, like after meeting him, getting to know him a little more, I thought I met the guy that I was going to end up with for the rest of my life. I didn't know anything bad about him. He just seemed so perfect. He was so charming, so funny, like just, oh my goodness, so many good things. And because I was caught up in that, all of that goodness, like that I thought he was the one for me. And I was so like almost desperate, I guess, to like meet somebody that I was going to end up with for the rest of my life. Because of that, I ignored a lot of the red flags. I didn't know enough about red flags going into that relationship. So just a couple that I want to share. The first one was he wouldn't talk about his past. He was 12 years older than me, or is 12 years older than me. He would not talk about his past. He obviously had a lot more experience with, relationships and whatnot, but he wouldn't open up about it. And I kind of justified that by saying to myself, well, his exes must have put him through a lot, or, making up excuses for him because I like fell in love with him right away. Another one was, I I didn't know about his drug addiction, but he was showing signs of withdrawals very early on. He would fall asleep in the middle of the day, like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then again, a couple hours later, he'd just fall asleep and take a really quick cat nap. And I was like, what? That really threw me off guard. And when I asked him about it, he's like, oh, I have narcolepsy. Narcolepsy, and his story sounded so believable. And so I was like, oh, you poor thing, it just kind of made me love him even more because I thought he was being honest with me. So tons of red flags, early on in our relationship. But, I kind of looked past a lot of things, mostly because I was naive. I didn't know. But we just kind of rushed into that relationship, moved in together after 2 months. By then, I actually found out about his drug addiction, got pregnant after 5 months. And by then, I remember feeling really trapped because I was already being abused emotionally and financially. And I was like, oh, well, this is just his way of, trying to keep me in the relationship. And it was working because I felt like I couldn't leave. And then 8 weeks into my pregnancy was the first time he became physical with me. And at that time, we broke up for a couple weeks. And I told myself, well, man, I really don't want to be a single mom. I saw all of the challenges my mom suffered through being a single mother. I did not want to be a single mom. Secondly, I did not want my child growing up without a dad because I grew up without a dad, and that was very hard on me. I didn't want my child having, the same self-esteem issues that I had. And then the third thing, I made this agreement with myself that if he's a good dad, I told myself, if he's a good dad after our child is born, it'll make up for everything he's put me through up until now. Like that'll, justify everything. So we got back together, moved back in together, closer to home in North Battleford, which is like 20 minutes from my home reserve, Sweetgrass. And our little daughter was born on August 9th of 2013. So we named her Kalayah Marie. And as soon as she was born, my whole mentality shifted. Suddenly, I don't care if my relationship works out with Chris. All I care about is my well-being and Kalayah's well-being, because I knew that, I had a huge responsibility put on me now. And if he wasn't gonna, step up and be a good dad and quit his addictions, then I'm out of here, kind of thing. So as soon as Kalayah was born, I started to pray really hard every day, either for a way out of the relationship or for Chris to step up and change and, be the dad he promised he was going to be. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about what happened next, because I go into a lot of detail in my book. But long story short, my prayers were answered 8 days later. Kalayah was only 8 days old. And he ended up beating me so severely that I thought I wasn't going to live past that night. Mm-hmm. And it was actually prayer that saved my life in that moment. And I just felt, after everything happened, after I was able to escape, after Kalayah was, safe and unharmed, I was just so thankful. I just felt so thankful that I was able to get out of there. And I kind of made this deal with myself again in the back of my head that obviously I survived for a reason. There's something, it probably has something to do with what I'm meant to do in life. And I decided the only way that I'm going to move past this, the only way I'm going to heal and, move on is if I start taking care of myself. So I started doing that. At first it wasn't every day, but now it's every day. It took over 6 years to get here. But I started doing a lot of things for self-care. So counseling, number one. I started going at least once a week. I share a lot more in the last chapter, but I'll share just a few here from a list that I came up with. I started listening to my body more. I started investing in myself, so spending money on myself, stepping out of my comfort zone, which was so hard. But the more I took care of myself, the easier it was. I decided I needed to break that cycle of violence in my family in order to set a good example. Changing the way I viewed things so that I'm not always playing the victim, taking ownership of my own mistakes, because Chris was my decision. I can't put the entire blame on him or the circumstances that I grew up with. He was my decision. Like, entering that relationship was my decision. And I stopped comparing myself to others. That was a huge thing that's really helped to get me to where I am. But the number one thing that I always share with people is the number one thing that I did to, accelerate my healing journey was to share my story. So the first time I did that was in October of 2017 in front of 500 strangers at a conference. It wasn't really planned, but I was part of a youth panel, and we were asked to share challenges that we've experienced to get to where we are. And I was like, I have to, I have to share.
So clearly, you repeated a lot of patterns. And I think a lot of people, to your point, when you tell your story, what I see, as a mental health and wellness specialist, is that a lot of people, like you said, they replace it. They look at it as, well, he's loving, or he appears nice, or he doesn't raise his voice, or those types of things. So it's almost like compensating in your mind because you want things to work so badly. And that's clearly a lot of what you did.
Yeah.
And, that kind of, speaking to the whole kind of cycle, when you look at where do we learn about relationships, obviously our first primary relationship is kind of important. And then we kind of start to, try to go out there and find that love that we were seeking that we didn't get as a child.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it kind of sounds like that's what you did. Pretty
much. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's, you left when your daughter was 8 days old.
Yeah.
That takes a lot, because obviously your hormones are still swirling. You've been through such a traumatic event. And, oftentimes with women that are abused, they sometimes, I think the statistic was something as high as 35 times where calls have been made out to the police before women actually make that step, which is very, very high. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. And then, to finally make that step, like you've got a baby, all those dreams, but then something in you must have clicked that said, okay, Kendra, like, enough is enough.
Mm-hmm.
And was it that little face that said she deserves better?
It was, yeah. And it was pretty much life or death, because I knew that what he was capable of had I stayed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you go out and when you talk to audiences, what's the primary thing that people share with you about abuse? What kind of things do they share?
A lot of people, well, I've heard women say that, and it's usually a secondary source that tells me. It's not, a lot of times it's not the woman themselves who will, come up and tell me that I didn't even realize, I was in an abusive relationship before, or, I didn't know about red flags either. I get asked quite a bit about red flags.
So speak to that a little bit more. Like you gave some examples, but define what a red flag is for anybody listening. That maybe they're kind of thinking, oh, I don't like my partner sometimes, or maybe he or she's not bad. But those red flags are some key indicators that it's enough for you to explore further. I often say sometimes we think something's a red flag, and if we might explore it, we might realize, okay, in fact, maybe I'm a little bit hypervigilant or super aware. But if the red flag is not a red flag, it kind of bears up. But if it's a red flag, it keeps showing itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's, I find that it's little, patterns of behavior that you notice in your partner, or you get these gut feelings, a lot of times it's you having to listen to your body. So if you have a gut feeling that your partner might be, talking to other women, for example, usually your gut is right. I talk a bit about that in my book too. So the night, when I was 8 weeks pregnant, I had this gut instinct that my partner was up to no good. So I looked through his phone and I, saw evidence that he was doing drugs again, so that was my gut telling me that I need to, watch out, kind of thing. So always trusting your gut instinct, because it's more than likely right. A few other red flags would be, they seem too good to be true. They're not opening up to you about a lot of things that you ask them, like about their past. They're short-tempered. This hasn't happened to me, but I did a little bit of reading up on some red flags. If they ever embarrass you in front of other people, like especially in public, that's a red flag. Just any kind of disrespect. If they're jealous, that's another major one. If they're easily jealous. Yeah.
So Reddy, I think to your point, and what a lot of people do is they kind of negate, like with that gut instinct. It's really true. We actually have more nerve cells in our gut than we do in our actual brain. Right. So that makes sense. So when we say I have a gut feeling, isn't any wonder, right? So with neuroscience now, they're able to prove that we actually get those messages first before it actually gets to the actual brain. So you started doing certain things to listen to your body, Kendra. What kind of things did you start to do that helped you get more connected to yourself? Because obviously you've been seeing this from a very, very young age. You learned that your needs didn't matter because your parents were so preoccupied with kind of their lives and their turmoil. Mm-hmm. So somewhere in there, that little girl said, what I need is not important. So I'm going to go outside of myself to fulfill my needs.
Yeah.
So what did you start to do to connect it? How did you know you were getting connected to what was really good for Kendra?
Oh man, it took a lot of just trying different things for self-care. Mostly it was stuff that were free because, I didn't have a lot of money after becoming a single parent. So counseling, getting that second opinion from a non-friend, non-family member, positive self-talk. I started doing I had to do that every single day. And at first I, had to fake it quite a bit because I was never kind to myself. So, I'd say fake comments, positive comments to myself when I looked in the mirror every day. But now it's like, I had to practice it every day so that it would kind of just flow naturally, which it does now. I'm a lot kinder to myself now, but you have to do it every day. Self-care is something you have to do every day. I started going to Reiki. So for those of you who haven't tried Reiki or aren't familiar with it, it's a form of energy healing. So very fortunately, there was a woman that lived on Sweetgrass, that I would go to see, I tried to see her once a month, but, I couldn't always afford it. And oh my goodness, like Reiki really helped me to just calm my anxiety because I had a really hard time sleeping for the first year after leaving. I was filled with so much anxiety. I was in and out of depression and just had a hard time calming myself. Some other things I started doing a little later on were I started playing sports again, which really helped to clear my mind, just getting active again. I started painting, which was a huge stress reliever. Like, I'd recommend art therapy to anybody. You don't have to be good at it. It's just, it's awesome. And I actually deliver guided art workshops as part of my my self-care workshops. Tension and trauma release exercises was another thing I started doing about 6 months, when Kalayah was about 6 months old. And same thing as Reiki, like, it just completely calms you.
And where did you learn these exercises?
So that one was introduced to me by a couple of old volleyball coaches, actually, in the North Battleford area. Marie Gra and Jackie Maloney. They're certified TRE instructors. So they, invited me out. They heard about what I went through.
What's TRE?
TRE stands for tension and trauma release exercises.
Okay.
Yeah. And they're very uncomfortable. Like, it's mostly your legs that just kind of shake uncontrollably. You can't really control, the amount of shaking, but it's like that your body just releases so much negativity, trauma that you've been through. Your body's kind of releasing it. And everyone's different. Like, everyone is going to react differently to it, but yeah, I just found it really beneficial. Amazing.
So I'm going to assume that someday you're going to have to tell Kalayah some of the story about why you left. For anybody out there that maybe knows that they have to get out of a situation or whatever, I'm just curious, what kind of words what would you say to Kalayah when she is a bit older and she starts asking? I'm sure she's already asking questions.
Yeah.
What do you say to her?
She asked nonstop when she was 4 years old. She's 6.5 now. And every single day, because she just really wants a dad. And she couldn't understand why, like, her dad, she never even met him, So I sat her down one day and I told her in a very child-friendly way, so that she'd understand, what, your daddy wasn't very nice to mommy. Your daddy hurt mommy. And if we would have stayed, he might have started hurting you too. And she's a very stubborn kid. And she's also a visual learner, like a lot of other kids. So I kind of thought, well, you know what? I was the same way when I was a kid. I know I was the same way. I was super stubborn. And I was like, well, I don't know how I'm going to, get through to this kid, get her to understand. So I was like, okay, I think I have to show her. So I showed her a picture of what I looked like after Chris had beaten me. And of course it made her upset. And she was, getting upset but it took me showing her that for her to understand. And I thought, well, you know what? I have to be honest with her, because she's going to grow up being angry with me for withholding that information, just like the way that I had anger and resentment towards my parents. So yeah, just be honest with your kids in a child-friendly way.
And that takes a lot of strength, right? Because you want to protect her, but then again, you don't want her to believe that you're keeping her away from her dad.
Exactly.
Without a valid reason.
Yeah.
Kendra, this is a very powerful story, because I think so many people struggle, and maybe it's not physical, but a lot of emotional relationships, and they stay because they stay for the same reasons. I didn't grow up with a dad. My mom and dad, separated early. I yearned for love, all those things, all the same reasons. And I think of my life story where I kind of repeated the pattern, and where there was not physical abuse, but I made a limited choice in my partner at 18. and it bore out in different ways. Because in my opinion, when you don't work through the issues that you brought up with, what happens is it can package a bit differently. And after 25 years of marriage, my marriage ended also for the elements of the things that blocked me from seeing what would have made me happy. So your journey makes a lot of sense. I'm sure a lot of people listening, men or women, can also relate. What words of any, now you do, she speaks, she trains. Now I hear there's art therapy with the self-care, which is awesome. Tell people a little bit where they can do, and if they want to come to one of your workshops or have you speak for their companies, where they can get a hold of you.
Yeah, so I have a website. It's just my first and last name, kendraweenie.com. That would probably be the best way to reach me, because it connects to my personal email. So there's that. I'm also on social media. So I have a Facebook page called Kendra Weenie Speaking and Workshops. And then I'm also on Instagram, but again, like through my website is probably the best way to get a hold of me.
Any last words of wisdom for anybody that may be struggling with a decision about leaving? What would you say to them, Kendra?
I would say, I'll actually leave off with the message that I usually leave off when I do presentations, and that is, everyone on this world is worthy. You are worthy of a good life, and you are worthy of healthy love, but you need to start by showing yourself love first.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. My takeaway is that just to listen. It's something very basic. And I think we get so harried in our lives that we don't slow down. And the gift of presence and mindfulness is something that you can do for yourself really quickly. It doesn't have to be, long extended, but you can do it to really challenge yourself, to really, whether it's to get out in nature for a walk or to close your eyes and listen to what your body's telling you, just little things that you can do daily. So again, Kendra, thanks for being here. For anyone who needs more information, I'm Roxanne Durhodge. I'm a mental health and wellness specialist. And if you're wanting to know, whether you are in a healthy relationship, you can connect with me at roxannedurhodge.com.
Thanks for tuning in to Authentic Living with Roxanne, creating the space for positive, healthy change. Roxanne is a keynote speaker, psychotherapist, and coach. To work with Roxanne, visit roxannedurhodge.com/blueprint. We'll see you next time on Authentic Living with Roxanne.